This is episode 3 of my working Lego bowling alley. In my last video I did the setting table and pin setter, and in this video I'll do the pin sweep as well as starting the pin distributor, which takes pins from there and puts them in the setting table. So the pin needs held but then released out of a trapdoor at the bottom. When this motor rotates, it pulls that piece, then releasing the pin out of the trapdoor at the bottom. That'll be connected to 2 more motors, so it can move in 2 axes. This is the first one. That 8-tooth gear connected to those gear racks allow it to move back and forth. Now we need that second axis, which will connect out here. This diagram shows how instead of movement we can just use a pivot point. And when we connect the earlier portion to that, it's able to reach all 10 pin slots. So with some supporting beams, it's now able to hold that up. So when I set that into its tracks, it's able to glide around. If I drop a pin into the holder, it then can move to a spot and drop the pin into its slot. And it can reach all 10 of those. So let's add a motor on top of here to control that angle. If the motor is attached too close to the pivot point, it moves way too aggressively, but moving it out there allows for finer adjustments. And with the addition of one more supporting element, it's now time for the pin sweep. Last episode, I designed that mechanism for the pin sweep, and now I need to implement it to the other side, but it's a little different because of that gap. So, using a bunch of beams to extend it all the way out, it now is able to glide on the other side too. Now we just need to connect those together, and giving it a test, it's not the smoothest. It can't really go under the pin setter right now. So let's move each side together by using a couple gears to get them in sync. And while I thought I could get away with some gears and a chain, that's just not strong enough. Part of the reason for this is because the pin sweep gets caught on the pin setter's rough edges. So, by using some rounded elements on all those sides there, the pin sweep is now able to glide right past. Even if it's off by an entire stud, it still gets corrected to the side of the pin setter. And by changing those gears and chains out for a couple beams, it's almost there, but those beams aren't the correct ones. By switching those beams for the correct ones, it's now able to fully sweep. Now it's time to motorize it, but my first attempt did not work at this. By having the motor only on one side, it applied uneven pressure to the 2 sides of the pin sweep. But correcting this by having the motor be in the center, as well as changing the gear ratio, makes it a lot stronger and keeps both sides at the same rate. As well as being able to fully sweep, it's able to partially sweep to where it just goes down in front of the pin setter when it's dropping or picking up the pins. So now, let's add the EV3 bricks, start them up, and begin programming. This is the initial test of just having one pin go through the pin setter. Upon pressing that button, it begins. And while the pin sweep doesn't go all the way down, that first pin is deposited and dropped onto the lane. Once the pin sweep now up, you'd be able to bowl, but for this program it just goes back down and attempts to pick up the pin. But that also fails, and the pin sweep isn't able to fully sweep either. There is a lot to work on here. With corrective adjustments done to the pin setter with how high and low it can go, and some adjustments done to the pin sweep, it's time for test 2. Test 2 begins a lot better, with that pin sweep able to go all the way down, as well as the pin being dropped onto the lane. With the pin sweep up, it'll now come back down in a moment, and now it's time to attempt to pick up the pin. And it's able to. And it's able to fully sweep as well. After dropping that pin and raising back up, let's try to fully sweep for good measure. And it's able to, so now let's start programming that pin distributor. Each pin has a unique X distance and degrees rotated to get to its pin slot. If we drop in this first pin into the holder and then press the button, it'll go to its first spot, so it went a little bit in the X direction and rotated a couple degrees. This button and these two color sensors tell each brick which stage the other ones are in. So if we dump some pins into the machine and press that button, telling it that the setting table just released pins into the pin setter, it'll start cycling for the next frame. Once pins reach the top, they go under those color sensors and would drop into the pin distributor. This yellow piece tells that color sensor that it's ready for a pin. So, because it just went under that color sensor, it gets told it's ready for a pin and drops it into the pin distributor. Now, let's test these systems together. So, once I press that button, it then presses that touch sensor button to let it know that that pin setting table just went off, depositing the pin into the pin setter. Now, it begins cycling. And once a pin goes under that color sensor up there, it gets dropped into the pin distributor and begins going into its pin slot. Like I was saying earlier, once that yellow piece goes under there, it then lets it know that it's ready for another pin and continues cycling. With all these systems working, we can add a front panel, as well as adding a better front panel to the pin sweep. Now it's time for a full test. After the setting table drops the 10 pins into the pin setter, they are then lowered and released onto the lane. With the pin sweep up, the player can now bowl. While not everything is working perfectly, these are just minor adjustments that I'll make before or during the next video. And with the pin sweep up, you can now bowl that second time. In my next episode, I'll work on the ball lift because right now the ball just kind of flies out of the machine, as well as expanding the lane and of course adding some gutters. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video.